Welcome to today's exploration of one of the Bible's most mysterious and debated topics, the Nephilim. These figures, appearing briefly in Scripture, have captured the curiosity of scholars, theologians, and casual readers alike for centuries. So, who exactly were the Nephilim? What role did they play in the Bible? And why have they been remembered through millennia? In this video, we are going to dive deep into the story of the Nephilim from three important perspectives: the canonical Bible, the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Jubilees. By looking at these three ancient texts, we can piece together a fuller, more detailed understanding of these mysterious beings and the cosmic drama they were part of. We'll begin with the foundational biblical account from Genesis. This text is crucial because it introduces the Nephilim and sets the stage for understanding their significance. From there, we'll explore the Book of Enoch, which delves into their origins in more detail and adds layers of context about their influence. Finally, we'll look at the Book of Jubilees, which offers a timeline and perspective that fills in the gaps left by other texts. To start, let's go back to the Book of Genesis, where the Nephilim first appear in the Bible. In Genesis 6, we read about a time when the earth was becoming filled with corruption and violence. The passage describes how the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim. These Nephilim are described as mighty men and men of renown, but the text gives us very little detail on what they actually were. What we do know is that this was a time of great moral decay. God saw that humanity's wickedness had become so great that he was grieved and decided to send a flood to cleanse the earth. But what exactly made the Nephilim such a pivotal part of this narrative? Why do these giants matter so much in the overall story of the Bible? The Nephilim are not just mentioned in passing. They are tied to a deeply spiritual and cosmic struggle, a struggle between what is holy and what is not. Their existence represented a breakdown of divine order. These beings, born of human women and, in some interpretations, fallen angels, symbolized a crossing of boundaries that should have never been crossed. Now you might be wondering, who were these sons of God? Are they angels, or were they something else? There are several interpretations, and scholars have debated this for centuries. Some believe the sons of God were fallen angels, spiritual beings who rebelled against God's design and took human form. Others propose that they were descendants of Seth, the righteous son of Adam, who intermarried with the descendants of Cain, a line marked by sin and rebellion. Yet another theory is that the sons of God were simply ancient kings or rulers who saw themselves as divine and took wives at will. Despite the ambiguity, what's clear is that the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men brought about the Nephilim, beings of great strength and power, but also a sign that the world had gone terribly wrong. It's important to understand that the Nephilim were not just giants in size. They were giant in influence and marked the world as a place of moral and spiritual decline. Before we dive deeper into these ancient texts, it's important to note that the Nephilim are not the only beings that challenge the boundaries between heaven and earth. Throughout Scripture, we see moments where the divine and the earthly intersect, moments that lead to both creation and destruction. The Nephilim, however, stand out because they represent both the danger and the allure of spiritual rebellion. The Genesis account gives us a glimpse of how their presence had an impact. While the Nephilim were not explicitly blamed for the flood, their existence highlighted the deepening corruption of humanity. The world had grown so violent and evil that it grieved God's heart. And so, the flood was not just an act of punishment, but a necessary cleansing of the earth. But what happens next? In our next section, we'll move beyond Genesis to the Book of Enoch, where the story of the Nephilim takes on an even more dramatic and detailed form. As we continue our exploration, we turn to the Book of Enoch, an ancient text that, while not part of the biblical canon, has greatly influenced Christian tradition and thought about the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch gives us much more detail about the origins of the Nephilim and their influence on the earth. This text provides a fuller picture of the events leading to the rise of the Nephilim and the dire consequences that followed. The Book of Enoch opens with the descent of a group of angels, known as the Watchers. These beings were originally sent to earth by God to observe and guide humanity. However, instead of fulfilling their divine mission, the Watchers became enamored with the beauty of human women. They broke their heavenly boundary by taking human wives, and their union produced the Nephilim, giants who were unlike anything the world had ever seen. This moment marks a pivotal point in the story. The angels, led by a figure named Semjaza, defy their appointed roles. They descend to earth, taking human wives and breaking divine boundaries. The decision to make a pact and share in the consequences together shows the depth of their rebellion. The Book of Enoch makes it clear that this act was a direct rebellion against God's command. The Nephilim, the offspring of these unions, are described as powerful and violent giants. They were not only physically imposing, but also marked by insatiable appetites. They devoured everything in their path, crops, animals, and eventually humans. Their violence spread throughout the earth, causing untold destruction. The land itself was becoming corrupted under their influence. But the Book of Enoch reveals that the Nephilim's impact wasn't just physical. Their presence had a far-reaching spiritual consequence. The angels who had descended to earth didn't just father giants. They also imparted forbidden knowledge to humanity. One of the Watchers, Azazel, taught humans how to make weapons of war, swords, knives, and armor, which led to widespread violence and bloodshed. He also taught humans how to create vanity-driven ornaments, mirrors, and other items that encourage pride and the distortion of truth. Other Watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge related to astrology, magic, and sorcery. These teachings disrupted the natural order and led humanity further away from God. While these revelations were seen by some as gifts, they brought confusion, chaos, and darkness to the world. The Book of Enoch paints a picture of a world in crisis, a world that had lost its way, as the knowledge from these rebellious angels fueled corruption and sin. But the effects of the Nephilim's presence went beyond just the physical world. The Book of Enoch tells us that the earth itself began to suffer. The blood of the innocent cried out to heaven, and the corruption was so vast that even the natural world seemed to grieve. The trees, the animals, and the very land itself were corrupted by the violence that the Nephilim brought with them. As the world descended further into chaos, the cries of the righteous reached heaven, and God decided to act. In response to the evil brought by the Watchers and their offspring, God sent 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, to intervene. Each angel had a specific task. Azazel, who had introduced the most harmful teachings, was to be bound and cast into a deep abyss in the desert, where he would remain until the final judgment. The other Watchers, including Semjaza, were also to be imprisoned beneath the earth, sealed away in fiery valleys until their punishment was complete. But what about the Nephilim themselves? The giants, born of both heavenly and earthly origins, could not pass away like ordinary humans. Their spirits, tainted by the rebellion of their fathers, wandered the earth as restless and invisible forces. The Book of Enoch explains that these spirits became the cause of much of the evil that plagued the world after their deaths. These disembodied spirits became the source of temptation, deception, and spiritual warfare, continuing to influence the hearts and minds of humanity for generations. Though the Nephilim's physical bodies were destroyed, their spiritual legacy endured. Their spirits, which once walked the earth in towering strength, now roam as dark forces, influencing human behavior and bringing chaos. These spirits, once giants, became the enemies of mankind, feeding on disorder, spreading deception, and drawing people away from the truth. The Book of Enoch not only chronicles the rise and fall of the Nephilim, but also lays bare the cosmic consequences of stepping outside of God's design. The Watchers and the Nephilim represent the dangers of spiritual rebellion, and the lasting impact of their actions serves as a warning for generations to come. With this detailed narrative from the Book of Enoch, we now have a clearer understanding of how the Nephilim were not just physical giants, but spiritual symbols of the consequences of defying divine order. Their presence in the world represented an inversion of God's plan for humanity, and their destruction was necessary to restore order. But the story doesn't end here. There's more to the Nephilim's legacy. Now, we turn to the Book of Jubilees, another ancient text that provides further insight into the Nephilim narrative. While this book is also not part of the canonical Bible, it provides additional details on the story of the Nephilim, the Watchers, and their consequences. The Book of Jubilees expands on the themes we've encountered so far, offering a structured timeline and further revelations about the Nephilim's impact on the world. The Book of Jubilees begins by providing a very clear and detailed context for the rise of the Nephilim. It describes the spiritual decline of the world during the days of Jared, long before Noah was born. This period is portrayed as one of great spiritual instability, where the heavenly and earthly realms began to blur, leading to the first acts of rebellion that would forever change creation. According to the Book of Jubilees, it was during this time that the Watchers, or angels, descended to earth. These beings were sent by God with the task of watching over humanity, ensuring that they followed God's laws and lived righteously. However, instead of fulfilling their duty, the Watchers became enamored with human women and broke divine boundaries. They took these women as wives, and their offspring, the Nephilim, were born. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes that the Nephilim were more than just giants. They were harbingers of chaos. These beings grew quickly, and their strength was beyond comprehension. But the text also highlights their violent nature. The Nephilim were not just large in size. They were consumed by an insatiable hunger, devouring the land's resources and turning against humans themselves. Their appetite for destruction seemed endless, and they brought suffering to the earth in ways that were almost beyond imagination. The Book of Jubilees goes on to describe the terrible consequences of these events. The earth itself, once a place of harmony, became a battlefield, twisted by the violence of the Nephilim and their celestial fathers. The text paints a grim picture of the natural world being distorted. The Nephilim were not just physical giants, they were spiritual disruptions, causing corruption wherever they went. The land, once full of life and promise, began to suffer under the weight of their rebellion. And it wasn't just humanity that felt the effects. Animals, plants, and even the skies and waters began to reflect the chaos unleashed by the Watchers' disobedience. This rebellion did not go unnoticed by God. As in the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees tells us that God responded to this crisis. The sin and violence caused by the Nephilim and their fathers had reached such a point that the world could no longer continue in its current state. The cries of the righteous and the suffering of creation reached God's ears. His response was not swift vengeance, but a carefully planned act of restoration. God's response to this corruption was the flood, a divine reset, a cleansing of the world from the effects of the Nephilim and the Watchers. But the Book of Jubilees provides additional context for the flood that deepens our understanding. The flood, as described in this text, was not merely a punishment for humanity's sin. It was a targeted response to the disruption caused by the Nephilim and the spiritual decay instigated by the Watchers. The flood was meant to remove these forces from the earth and restore order to the natural world. However, the Book of Jubilees also addresses what happens to the spirits of the Nephilim after the flood. While their bodies were destroyed in the waters, their spirits could not simply cease to exist. Instead, these spirits, born of both heavenly and earthly origins, became restless, wandering the earth as malevolent forces. These spirits, according to the Book of Jubilees, would continue to influence humanity, causing temptation and leading people away from the truth. The text then takes a profound turn as it reveals God's plan to deal with the Nephilim's lingering spiritual legacy. God commanded that the spirits of the Nephilim be bound and restrained, unable to roam freely or wreak havoc without limitation. However, a fraction of these spirits, about 1/10, were allowed to remain active. They would serve under the authority of Mastema, the leader of the evil spirits. But even these spirits were not allowed to act freely. They were confined to operate only within limits set by God, ensuring that they could not completely dominate humanity or defeat those who remained faithful to God. This narrative in the Book of Jubilees brings to light the idea that, while the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, the spiritual battle continued. Their disembodied spirits remained, causing spiritual strife and temptation throughout history. Their presence underscores the ongoing struggle between good and evil, the forces of light and darkness, which continue to influence the world to this day. Through this lens, the Book of Jubilees portrays the Nephilim not as a single event in history, but as part of a larger cosmic battle. The flood was just one act in a divine plan to address the chaos brought about by the Watchers and the Nephilim. The destruction of the Nephilim's physical bodies was a necessary step, but the story does not end there. The spirits of the Nephilim, though restrained, would continue to haunt the earth, reminding humanity that evil and rebellion are never fully eradicated. In the aftermath of the flood, the Book of Jubilees emphasizes the importance of righteousness and spiritual wisdom. After Noah and his family survived the flood, God gives them commandments and laws to follow. These laws were not just for Noah, but were meant to guide future generations, helping them resist the temptation and spiritual deception left behind by the Nephilim. The text suggests that through obedience to God's law, humanity could find protection from the forces of evil that continued to operate in the world. As we reflect on our journey through the Nephilim narrative, it's crucial to understand that their story isn't just a tale from the distant past. It's a narrative that carries profound spiritual lessons that still resonate in our lives today. The Nephilim, their origins, and the events that surrounded them were not mere historical anomalies or mythical stories. These ancient accounts speak to a deeper truth about the ongoing battle between good and evil and the consequences of straying from God's design. The Bible, the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Jubilees provide different perspectives on the Nephilim, but they all converge on one central truth. When humanity chooses to step outside of God's design, the consequences are catastrophic. The Nephilim were not simply giants of great size. They were a symbol of a world that had crossed divine boundaries, disrupting the fabric of creation itself. Their existence left a deep scar, not only on the world in which they lived, but on the very spiritual realm that governs all things. While we acknowledge the darkness and corruption they brought into the world, these ancient texts also offer a glimmer of hope, pointing us toward God's intervention, redemption, and the restoration of all things. One of the first lessons we learn from the Nephilim story is the nature of rebellion. The Watchers, the angels who were tasked with guiding and protecting humanity, chose to disobey God. They stepped outside of their appointed roles, and their rebellion led directly to the creation of the Nephilim. These giants were not merely the physical product of an unnatural union between divine beings and human women. They were a spiritual defiance, a violation of God's divine boundaries that resulted in the corruption of humanity and the earth itself. What the Nephilim story teaches us is that rebellion against God does not simply break rules. It creates a world in which disorder reigns, where sin and violence thrive, and where creation itself begins to break down. The Nephilim represent what happens when human will aligns itself with spiritual forces that are not of God, and the chaos that follows can be devastating, affecting not just individuals, but entire societies and generations to come. The second powerful lesson from the Nephilim story comes from the lasting impact of their legacy. We see this most clearly in the Book of Numbers, where the 12 spies are sent to scout the land of Canaan. When they return, they are terrified, describing the people they encountered as giants, descendants of Anak, who they believed were the Nephilim. Though the Bible does not definitively confirm these people as direct descendants of the Nephilim, the mere mention of the name Nephilim paralyzed the spies with fear. They saw themselves as grasshoppers in comparison to these giants, and their fear overshadowed their faith in God. The Nephilim had become more than just a historical memory. They had evolved into a symbol of fear. Their name carried a mythological weight, a legacy of intimidation that caused the Israelites to doubt God's promises and His power. The fear of these giants, whether real or exaggerated, stopped the Israelites from moving forward into the promised land. The fear of past challenges can paralyze us in the present, just as it did to the Israelites. However, this story reminds us that God's promises are more powerful than our fears. When we face our own giants, whether they are obstacles in life or spiritual challenges, we are called to trust in God's strength, not the size of the fear before us. The Nephilim's legacy shows us that while fear can hold us back, faith in God's power will always lead to victory. The flood, which came as a response to the Nephilim's corruption, serves as a pivotal moment in the narrative. However, it's important to understand that the flood wasn't simply about judgment. It was also about restoration. As described in the Book of Jubilees, God's decision to send the flood was part of a divine plan to reset the world, cleansing it from the corruption introduced by the Nephilim and the rebellious angels that sired them. The flood washed away the physical presence of the giants, but it didn't end the spiritual battle. Even after the flood, the spirits of the Nephilim were said to wander the earth, continuing to influence humanity in destructive ways. Even in the midst of judgment, God was preparing a way forward, offering humanity a chance for redemption through Noah, a righteous man whom God preserved to carry forward the hope of a restored world. The flood teaches us a powerful lesson. God's judgment is never arbitrary. It is always purposeful. It is a response to evil, but it's also a path to restoration. God's judgment, though severe, is never without a redemptive purpose. He provided a way out, a means for humanity to start over. This teaches us that even in our darkest moments, when we face judgment for our own disobedience, God is always working to restore what has been broken. His ultimate desire is not destruction, but redemption, and He always provides a way forward for those willing to turn back to Him. The Nephilim story also serves as a spiritual warning. The restless spirits of the Nephilim, described in the Book of Jubilees, are said to wander the earth, seeking to lead humanity astray. These spirits represent the dark, unseen forces that continue to influence the world today. As believers, we must remember that the battle we face is not only physical but spiritual. The Nephilim's existence, both in the flesh and as restless spirits, demonstrates the long-term impact of sin and rebellion, and the ongoing spiritual battle we are part of. These forces of evil are real, even if they aren't always visible to the human eye. But we also take comfort in knowing that, just as God intervened in the days of the Nephilim, He is still active in the spiritual realm today. God has provided us with the tools we need to resist temptation and stand firm in our faith. Finally, the story of the Nephilim culminates in a powerful call to righteousness and obedience. Through the flood, through the rise and fall of the giants, and through the eventual spiritual consequences of their rebellion, we see that humanity is called to follow God's design for life. Disobedience leads to destruction, but obedience leads to peace and restoration. In the face of spiritual warfare and the forces of evil, we are reminded that God is with us. He provides the protection, guidance, and strength we need to overcome the forces that seek to draw us away from His truth. The Nephilim story is not just about giants and fallen angels. It is a reminder that the battle between good and evil is ongoing, and that we must remain vigilant in our faith. In conclusion, while the Nephilim may have been physical giants, their story is a spiritual one that continues to shape our understanding of the ongoing battle between good and evil. The consequences of rebellion, the power of fear, and the hope found in divine intervention all play crucial roles in this narrative. As we move forward, we are reminded that no matter what giants may stand in our way, God is greater than them all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Nephilim story. If this video has opened your eyes to new insights or deepened your understanding of the spiritual forces at play in the world, we invite you to like and share this video with others who may benefit from it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our upcoming content. God bless you, and may you continue to seek truth and grow in faith as you walk in His light.